Let me go and delete everything from my scene, and let's talk about the Subdivision Surface Modifier and the Smoothing Modifier. What are they? Where are they? How can we make our own? And what's the point of them all? Let me start by showing you the implication with a single cube. So I'll go and give you a primitive, which is a cube. Now watch these settings. This is going to be important to look at this. It's a 1 meter cube with 1 division. So that means it really only has 8 vertices, 4 on the top, 4 on the bottom, and nothing else. So it's basically 6 planes and nothing else. If I go and accept that, here's my cube. That's nice. He's a little bit bright, so I might just give him a different color while I'm here. Something, I don't know, do we like green? We like blue, don't we? There we go, that's nice and blue. It's a little hot, but we're okay with that. You'll see you'll see the implications. I might just go, because I like it, add a filament draw options node and turn down the way my HDRI is interpreted by filament. So there we go. So with the cube now, if I head over to my parameter section and I'll have a look at mesh resolution up here, that parameter is here, mesh resolution, but all I have is base. And this means that there's no subdivision surface modifier applied to this object. And many hard surface modeled objects in DAZ Studio that you bring in from assets that you bought, they don't have that. Like architecture often doesn't have that. Most clothing items often do have a higher subdivision implied. So what this means is that each polygon in the scene will be handled as it is right now. But if I were to add a subdivision modifier to it, then this face here will be divided into 4 or higher, depending on what the setting is that I'm setting. So currently I have 1 polygon at the top, but if I add a subdivision surface modifier, I'll have at least 4. If I set it to 2, I'll have 4 times 4, so that's 16. If I have set it to 3, then I have 4 times 4 times 4, and so forth. And you can see what the implication is to the object. If you do that, you get a higher resolution, but you don't add it on the object, so it's not in the actual geometry. DAZ Studio adds this on the fly. So this is a calculation process that happens basically at the end. So it's not baked into the geometry. It's something that happens at the end. Yes, you're welcome, Commander, no problem. But so yeah, that's what a subdivision surface modifier does, and it gets rid of janky edges. So if I go, I should have really left my my male Genesis guy in the scene. I'll bring him in as well, because he by default has a subdivision surface modifier applied. Let me go and bring him over here. Let's have a look at his face. So he looks very smooth literally everywhere. So if I go and select him now on parameter settings, I can see that on his mesh resolution, I have 2 options here. I have high resolution and I have base resolution, so I can switch between them. And also I have a bunch of settings down here, like how do I calculate this and what actually happens. And this tells DAZ Studio how to mathematically add these extra polygons. And this here, subdivision level and render sub-D level, that tells DAZ Studio what to display in the viewport. So if I go and switch this from base resolution, from high resolution to base resolution, you can see, especially on his ears, that the guy's getting a little bit chunky here. Righty, this is the actual resolution. This is the actual geometry of the figure. And if I switch this to high resolution, things look a lot smoother in the viewport. So this setting here is what we currently see DAZ Studio apply in the viewport. And this setting here is what we see DAZ Studio apply in the render. So there's 2 versions of this. This one will calculate slightly faster, which is why it's basically this -1, so that you get less implied polygons in the viewport. That means the computer will be faster to do its thing when you move things around in the viewport. But for the final render, we say we increase this by 1, so we subdivide 1 more time. But so the benefit of this is that the actual file size of the Genesis figure is relatively small, whereas the render resolution or the display resolution is much higher, because DAZ Studio calculates this on the fly. Blender and many other 3D applications have exactly the same concept. Even hexagon has that. It's sometimes it's called implied polygons. And if I go and set this to higher, like set this to 2, then you see that the render resolution goes up to 3. So the render resolution appears to be always 1 higher, but we don't have to do that. So you can set these independently. You could set this to 0. That means in the render it's not subdivided, but in the viewport it is. Some people render their images with an even higher set here, so they sometimes set this to 3. You can set this to something even higher by going to the parameter settings and just disabling the limits option, or typing in a different limit, like, I don't know, 6, and then, you know, you can crank this slider higher if you wanted to do that, but you can see that the computer gets unresponsive. Don't try this with things like hair, because it really adds an insane amount of polygons. Like, we're talking millions of polygons to your scene. So yeah, I think I may have, done something really bad now, because DAZ Studio is not responding anymore. One of those things. So yes, the limits are there for a reason. And the new Genesis 8.1 figure actually has one higher subdivision level than the Genesis 8 figure, so that is, they can show even more detail by default. But you can do this to any figure, and maybe DAZ Studio comes back to life at one point. If not, I have other versions that I can show you the next part of. So I was going to show you how you can add this to your own objects if you needed it, and also what happens to objects that are not designed to take a subdivision surface modifier. So usually organic shapes. Is it coming back? Is it coming back? Yes, absolutely. So don't set it to 4. That's what I'm saying. Don't set it to 4. I guess that is my limit. Oh no, there we go. It's actually set to 5. Look at that. That is very cool. We're still pretty smooth, but I don't really see that much of a difference anymore. I mean, I suppose we have to have a certain amount of resolution, otherwise we wouldn't see benefits, but I don't really see a benefit between 5 and, let's say, 2. Do we see any difference? I didn't see one. It's one of those things. Yeah, and it takes so long because DAZ Studio has to go and calculate all these things. Let me go and just make my guy invisible and talk about the cube again. So as I said before, the cube doesn't have what the 3D modelers call these edge loops inserted. It's literally just 6 sides and 8 vertices, and that is it. If I wanted to add my own subdivision surface modifier to this, I'll head over to Edit, I believe, Object, Geometry. It's kind of hidden here. Convert to sub D. That's how DAZ Studio adds this modifier. So when we do that, watch what happens to the cube. Nothing good. That is what happens to the cube. It turns into what Blender would know as a UV sphere. And it seemingly has destroyed my object. So it tells me that it's important that you understand why this didn't work, because there was nothing to hold the geometry in place. So it literally just DAZ Studio just tries, or the algorithm just tries to smooth everything, and there's nothing that's holding anything that was supposed to be sharp in place. So it just goes and collapses. And if I go and set this to something higher now, I'm getting basically a really flat, smooth sphere. But my object never started out as a sphere, which is kind of weird. So, if I go and change this from high resolution back to base, then I can see that my base geometry is still very much a cube. But only now when I switch to the high res do I get this. So I guess my point in explaining that, I think that's where I left off, was that a subdivision surface modifier can't be applied to any geometry, so the geometry needs to be made for that. I've made small models when I started building things in 3D, and I thought, let me make that smooth, and of course this is what the object looked like, and it's not really what we want. So let me go and not so much get rid of the cube. I'm just going to go and move it over here. That's another thing that actually, while I'm exploring it here, while I move it, there's a setting in DAZ Studio that will defer this, making it high resolution while you move an object. You can disable that as well, just so that you know it's there. I don't quite, do I remember where that is? Was it in Draw Settings? General, was that in here? Yeah, there we go. So in your Draw Settings tab, if you don't have that, you can always open it from here, from Window, tabs and go to your draw settings. This is something that is applicable to the current viewport that you've got enabled. So this is now just for the filament viewport. There's this option here, manipulation binding delayed. So sorry, subdivision updates delayed. And if you switch that to continuous, then you'll see that as I left click and drag my objects around, all subdivision bits and pieces will be held in place until I drop the object. But that's sometimes very heavy. So on my cube, it's literally non-existent. But if this was a character, if this was multiple characters, maybe with hair and with clothing, you'll see that it's very difficult to move the character because it takes so long for the computer to kind of update and catch up. So if that's why that is usually switched to delayed. And the result is that when you left click and drag the object, the subdivision will be disabled so that you can position your character or your object, and as you let go of the left click, then this is what happens, and that's when everything will be snapped back in place. You see this type of system on animations and on poses. When you dial in sliders, your figure turns kind of chunky, then it changes, and then it changes back into smooth. That's the smoothing modifier in action. Let me go and create another cube here. Same idea, primitive cube, but in this time I'm going to make it the same size, but this time I'm going to give it more divisions than 1. Let's go give him 10 divisions just for now. And if I do that, I have the same cube. I might give it a different color. Maybe make it the red cube or the reddish cube. Something like that. Very nice. So it now has more divisions. So it currently doesn't have a subdivision surface modifier applied. Yeah, actually, I liked it when you were there. So let's do that now. So on cube 2, I'll go to edit, object, geometry, and add my subdivision surface modifier. And look at what happened. The cube is still a cube, and that is because it had more subdivisions. So it had geometry that held its shape in place. It just became a lot smoother. So you see, it doesn't have sharp edges anymore. It now has smooth edges. And this is kind of nice to see. If I were to make my subdivision modifier higher, so if I increase the sub D level, watch what happens to the curve here. It'll be just more smoothed out. And the higher I make this level, the more implied polygons I have, and the smoother this edge will become, even though the base resolution was still a very sharp cube with sharp edges. So that's how that works. There's one other thing I wanted to show you in which you can see the actual polygon. So currently we don't see anything, but there's a different, if you switch this over to wire texture shaded, you will see all these lines drawn on here. And you can see that the larger ones, these ones here, or the thicker ones, let's just say, those are the actual, this is the real facet on the cube. That's real geometry. And anything that's kind of thin and gray here, that is implied geometry. So we see the same on the blue cube. We can see the thicker lines, and those are the real facets, and everything else is just implied geometry that happens as a result of the subdivision surface modifier. So watch what happens as I increase and decrease my level. You'll see more and less of these kind of light gray faces. If I make that less, then you see that this is how the subdivision works. This is no subdivision. This is 1 level, 2 levels, 3 levels, and so forth. And this is how you can see how the geometry on an object literally increases. And what happens if you don't have geometry that holds it in place? One of those things. Alter, you have a roofer. My goodness, we have a window guy showing up today. How exciting. We're all into home improvement. Very cool. Tao, very good to see you. And Michael, welcome back. Good to see you too. Yeah, subdivision surface is one of those things you gotta really know what it is, what it does. And I had great difficulties with this concept. I didn't even know it existed, because on some objects it's applied, on others it isn't. And if you apply it on some of your objects, it doesn't work. And why is that, and all that? So if you ever make something like just a plain object in Blender, and you need geometry that holds things in place, you add edge loops. So we don't really need all this subdivision here. We need probably, this is the real face here. or the real edge. We need this one, but we don't really need anything from here to there. Those divisions we don't really need if we build this object in something like Blender. We'd only go and have the base geometry, and then we just add one edge loop that holds the geometry in place at the top and one at the bottom, and then two on the sides and then two on those sides, and then that'll be enough to hold the cube in place, or rather not the cube, your object that you're making. But with organic shapes it's different, so there we go. So that's the Subdivision Surface Modifier, and the implication on export is that if you were to export this cube now, and you say just file export and just turn it as an OBJ or as an FBX, let's try an OBJ, let's call it cube, then in here there's really no option to not apply the effect. So what DAZ Studio will do on export is it'll say, hey, I'm going to export the subdivided object. I'm not going to export the original geometry. I'm going to use the subdivided version, which in my case is a lot more polygons than it was originally. So the cube itself is very slim and small. But if I were to export this now, the subdivision will be applied. And as a result, I'm getting a rather large cube. I'm gonna go and do this again. I'm just gonna give it a different name just so that you can see the difference here. So I'll put it on my desktop and I'll call it Cube Divided. And then I'll just use my regular DAZ Studio preset and hit accept. And I'll just do that because if I now go and change this from high resolution to base resolution, seeing this, I'll go and do this again, export. I'll call it Cube Simple, maybe, and then I'll do the same thing. I hit accept. I've made a mistake. I didn't hide my other objects. So I'm probably still seeing basically a cube and a sphere now, but that's the point. Rather, is to show you the difference in size. So we have Cube Simple here, which is 120 kilobytes in size, and we have Cube Divided here, which is 1.2 megabytes in size. So you can see that the size of the actual object increases as well. So the description of the OBJ file is just much larger. So the implication, and this is why it's so important, is that when you export a high resolution object, make a change on it in Blender, and then you try to bring it back, that's where DAZ Studio says, sorry, that's different geometry. That's geometry change that's happened. So that's why I can't create a morph from your change now. This is literally why that happens. Whereas when you leave it on the base geometry, then DAZ Studio sees it's the same vertex count and I can bring it in as a morph. So that's why that happens. So that is that. This is how you apply it. This is where you add it. But it's something completely different. And this is the other part I wanted to talk about. It's something completely different than the smoothing modifier. So the smoothing modifier is another thing altogether that basically has a collider object that you can dedicate. So in addition to this, I can now go and maybe on my cube, I'll make it high resolution again. I'm going to go and add another thing, and this is the smoothing modifier. I've explained this in the video in which you can sit people on an object. This is exactly the same idea. So I go back with the cube selected to Object, Geometry, add smoothing modifier. So this is a different thing. It's a different modifier. If I do that, it'll go and add another thing in the parameters tab here. So this was mesh resolution and this is now mesh smoothing, and it allows me to specify a collision item. So right now my red cube hasn't changed, which is good. That's that's kind of what I want, because I don't have a collision collision item. But if I add a collision item, and I'll maybe make that the cube 1, then I can go and take my cube 1 and go and put it. It's just weird when it does that, isn't it? So you can't switch that off. If you find that really weird, you can just go and disable that. Maybe I will do that under my draw settings. So subdivision surfaces might just continuous. So now when I go and move my sphere thing, as I go and move it here, my cube underneath it is deformed by another object. So this is another operation entirely. And this is kind of cool. And this couldn't happen if my bottom object didn't have as much geometry. So this kind of helps that we have both the subdivision surface as well as more divisions in the original geometry. But it also, if you had a cube that some of my viewers had this, that they made a cube that didn't have divisions, and then they tried to make an indentation with the subdivision surface modifier, and they didn't have so much success, and that is only because they didn't have any divisions in the bottom cube. So that's why that's important, Commander Cody. The two different things, the subdivision surface modifier and the smoothing modifier, two different things. Very cool things that you can do with it. I mean, look at the geometry shaping underneath it. It's quite fascinating, isn't it? This can be used for so many exciting things, to make indentations that follow an object, like, you know, punch somebody in the face with a fist. You can literally land the fist in the guy's face and leave an indentation in there, or do all kinds of other exciting stuff. But for that to work, your underlying object needs to have geometry, otherwise DAZ Studio won't be able to bend it. So if this is a cube with only 6 faces, there would be nothing it could bend. Commander Cody, let me know if this explains it. If not, then do let me know. I'm more than happy to elaborate on this.